reading a translated text is, it's actually a lot like watching a massive, big-budget 3D movie. But, like, as you were walking into the theater, you were totally distracted.
Right, yeah.
And you completely forgot to grab the 3D glasses from that little plastic bin.
Oh, that's the worst.
Yeah. So you just sit down in the dark, the movie starts, and, I mean, you get the plot, obviously. You know who the good guys are, you know who the bad guys are. You can generally follow the dialogue well enough to get the character arcs. But you're missing the depth.
You're missing the whole experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You are entirely missing the texture of the world. And worst of all, you are completely missing the things that the director deliberately designed to fly right at your face and make you flinch.
Right.
You're just watching a flat version of a multi-dimensional masterpiece. So, for today's deep dive, we are handing you those glasses.
Put them on.
Yeah, put them on. Because our mission for this session is to bypass the English language entirely and explore the massive, hidden iceberg of meaning that lies just beneath the surface of these ancient texts.
It's a huge iceberg, too.
It really is. We are focusing exclusively on what you don't see in English. We're going to dig into bizarre linguistic quirks, complex structural poetry, historical manuscript variations, basically all the things that just vanish the second a translator tries to force them into our modern vocabulary.
And putting those glasses on, it truly reveals a completely different landscape.
Oh, totally.
I mean, if you're listening to this and you've ever felt like an ancient text was maybe a bit dry or, overly repetitive, you're going to see today that the issue usually isn't the original author.
Right.
The issue is the filter we are reading it through.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. So what kind of sources are we looking at today to actually pull this off?
Well, we're utilizing a really phenomenal stack of sources today. We're looking at deep linguistic analyses of Koine Greek and Biblical Hebrew.
Nice.
We're also pulling from some scholarly papers on ancient poetic structure, so things like chiasmus and alphabetic acrostics that most modern readers just completely pass over without realizing they're even there.
I know I do.
Yeah, we all do. We also have some brilliant, incredibly granular case studies on the translation choices made in the famous David and Bathsheba narrative.
Which is just a crazy story.
It is, and it turns out to be an absolute masterclass in ancient tragic wordplay. And then we're going to cap it all off with a really fascinating historical look at the battle between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text.
Oh, the manuscript wars.
Exactly, and why the specific manuscript your translator happened to use actually changes the entire theology of the book.
Wow. Okay, well, we really need to start at the atomic level, right? Before we can zoom out to the grand architecture of these ancient stories, we have to look at how the original languages actually construct actions and ideas.
Right, down to the verbs.
Yeah, because they do it in ways that English just isn't equipped to replicate at all.
Okay.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with Koine Greek.
The common language of the Eastern Mediterranean.
Right, the language the New Testament was written in. And it possesses something called the middle voice. So, to set the baseline for you listening at home in English, we essentially operate on a binary system when it comes to the voice of a verb, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
We have the active voice, like, I hit the ball.
Yeah.
The subject, me, performs the action.
Standard, everyday English.
Exactly. Then, we have the passive voice. I was hit by the ball. So the subject is being acted upon by an outside force.
Right.
You're either doing the thing or the thing is happening to you. It's a simple, straightforward binary. But Greek throws this massive wrench into that with a third category.
Yeah, and that binary framework we rely on in English is really the root cause of so much lost nuance.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in Koine Greek, the active and passive voices exist, sure, but sitting right there alongside them, occupying this incredibly rich philosophical space, is the middle voice.
So what exactly is that doing?
Well, the middle voice is essentially an intensification of the relationship between the subject and the action. It doesn't just indicate that you're doing an action, it communicates that the subject is intimately involved in or deeply benefits from or is fundamentally altered by that action.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a reflexive, deeply personal participation in the verb. The action sort of folds back onto the actor.
Okay, let me see if I can map a modern analogy onto this just to make sure I'm grasping the mechanics here.
Go for it.
If I were to use the active voice in English, I might say, I cooked a meal.
Right, just a flat statement of historical fact.
Exactly. I performed the action of cooking. But if English actually possessed a middle voice, would it sound something more like, I nourished my soul by the deeply personal act of cooking this meal for myself. Is like that level of internal involvement.
That captures the spirit of it beautifully, yeah.
Yeah.
And the middle voice takes a mechanical action and it just infuses it with personal stake or benefit.
That is so cool.
It is. Let's look at a highly charged, really tragic example from the source material, specifically from the Gospel of Matthew. When Judas Iscariot realizes the sheer gravity of his betrayal, the English text simply says he went away and hanged himself.
Right.
Now, in English, that phrase gets the basic, gruesome, physical point across. We understand the mechanism of his death,
Sure.
but the Greek verb used there is aponsato, and it is conjugated in the middle voice.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's not just an active verb with a reflexive pronoun bolted onto the end. The middle voice carries this profound, terrible weight of personal involvement.
So it's not just the physical act.
Exactly. It implies that the action was performed by Judas upon himself, reflecting a deeply reflexive, intimate, and tragic participation in his own demise. It's literally a grammatical reflection of his internal psychological state.
Showing that he was completely consumed by his own action.
Yes.
That completely changes the texture of the scene. The grammar itself is carrying the emotional weight, almost acting as a psychological profile of his despair.
It really is.
I actually have another example from the linguistic sources that I want to test out. The Greek word katalambano.
Oh, that word perfectly illustrates the shift from physical to mental action.
Okay, so if I'm reading the analysis correctly, in the active voice, katalambano means to physically seize something.
Right.
Like if you reach out and snatch a cup off a table, or a police officer runs down a street and physically apprehends a fleeing suspect, you actively seize them.
You're physically grabbing it.
Yeah. But when you shift that exact same verb into the middle voice, the meaning pivots entirely. It comes to mean comprehending something or mentally grasping an idea.
Exactly.
So it's the difference between your hands grabbing a physical object and your mind seizing a complex idea, wrestling it into your own consciousness and making it your own.
Yeah, because mental action, by its very nature, is confined within the sphere of the agent.
Right.
You are the one doing the comprehending, and you are the one receiving the cognitive benefit of that comprehension.
That makes total sense.
The middle voice is just the grammatical vehicle designed to capture that specific internal dynamic.
But, I mean, this raises a pretty glaring logistical question for the translator sitting at their desk.
Oh, the translator's dilemma.
Yeah. If the middle voice simply does not exist in English grammar, how on earth do they translate it? Do we just completely lose the emotional flavor of the verb? Are you just out of luck if you can't read Greek?
Translators find themselves in an incredibly difficult position here. Much of the inherent flavor is, inevitably, just lost in the transfer.
That's a bummer.
It is. To compensate, a translator often has to lean heavily on the surrounding context of the paragraph. Or they might insert italicized words to try and force the English sentence to carry the Greek weight.
Oh, like adding extra words that weren't really there.
Yeah. For instance, they might translate a middle verb by adding phrases like, he did it for himself, or she acted on her own behalf.
Right.
But doing that bloats the sentence. It makes the English feel clunky and overly wordy. The Greek achieves that entire complex psychological dynamic seamlessly with just a tiny inflection at the end of a single verb.
It's like trying to describe a color that just doesn't exist in the human visual spectrum.
Exactly.
We simply don't have the grammatical rods and cones to process it.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
And it's not just grammar where we lose the depth of the original text, is it? We also lose a massive amount of intentional ambiguity.
Oh, yes. Ambiguity is huge.
Because, I mean, if you grew up speaking English and you took a creative writing class, you are almost certainly taught that ambiguity is a flaw.
Right. Be clear. Be precise.
Exactly. You're told to pick the exact word for the exact meaning. But our sources make it incredibly clear that in the ancient Near Eastern world, ambiguity was a feature, not a bug.
It was considered a high art form. Ancient writers loved words with multiple overlapping meanings.
Yeah.
But translation, by its very mechanical nature, forces a choice. A translator cannot put two conflicting definitions in the main text at the same time. They have to pick one meaning to write down.
And the moment they make that choice,
The other meaning is instantly erased for the English reader.
there is this brilliant, almost comedic example of this from the Gospel of John, chapter 3.
Oh, with Nicodemus.
Yes. You have Jesus talking in the middle of the night to this highly educated religious leader named Nicodemus. And Jesus tells him that if he wants to see the kingdom of God, he must be born anothen.
Right, anothen.
Now, the Greek word anothen carries a very distinct double meaning. It can mean again, as in a second time in sequence. But it also means from above, as in originating from a higher place.
Two totally different concepts in English.
Right. So Nicodemus hears the word and he immediately latches onto the first meaning. Again. He thinks Jesus is suggesting he literally, physically returned to his mother's womb as a grown man.
Which Nicodemus rightfully points out is biologically absurd.
Exactly. But Jesus is utilizing the second meaning, from above, referring to a spiritual divine birth.
The entire narrative tension of that late-night encounter, the subtle humor of the Socratic irony Jesus is using, and the profound confusion of a highly educated scholar, all of it relies entirely on the fact that the word anothen means both of those things simultaneously.
But in English, the translator's hands are totally tied.
They are. They have to print either born again or born from above.
And whichever path they choose, the jug is lost.
Completely lost.
The listener is deprived of the reason Nicodemus is so profoundly confused. You're basically watching a brilliantly written comedy sketch where the punchline has been muted by the translator.
That's exactly what it feels like. And this intentional theological ambiguity isn't just a Greek phenomenon either. It is woven all throughout the Hebrew Old Testament as well.
Yeah, the sources point to a really fascinating translation issue surrounding the Hebrew words yam and nahar.
This is a perfect example of how language and ancient culture just completely intersect. If you open the King James Version, or really any standard modern English translation, you'll see the word yam translated simply as sea, and the word nahar translated as river.
Oh, seems normal.
And on a purely practical geographic level, that is an accurate translation of those nouns. But we have to look at the cultural context of the ancient Near East, specifically the Ugaritic texts and the Canaanite pantheon.
Okay, so what's the connection there?
In that broader cultural sphere, Yam and Nahar were not just bodies of water. They were the literal proper names of the Canaanite gods of the sea and the river,
Oh.
deities of chaos and destruction.
So if you're an ancient Hebrew reader and you read a poetic text about Yahweh battling or subduing the sea and the river, you're actually seeing a vivid double image.
Yes.
You're seeing God exhibiting control over the physical elements of water like splitting the Red Sea, but simultaneously you're reading a highly aggressive theological smackdown of the neighboring Canaanite deities.
A total smackdown. It's cosmic divine warfare cleverly wrapped in the language of a nature poem.
That is so cool.
It's a multi-layered polemic. The Hebrew authors are using the names of rival gods as common nouns to show that Yahweh has absolute dominion over both the physical world and the spiritual realms of their neighbors.
While English readers just see a nice poem about water.
Exactly, entirely missing the theological combat happening just beneath the surface.
That's wild. And that actually brings us to another massive fundamental difference between English and Hebrew.
Right.
The English language relies heavily on abstract concepts to convey deep thought. Like we constantly use words like justice, mercy, anger, spirit, or love.
Abstractions are everywhere in English.
Right, but Hebrew, especially ancient biblical Hebrew, rarely operates in the abstract. It is an intensely, relentlessly concrete physical and visual language.
This is one of the most fascinating takeaways from the sources, honestly.
Okay, so consider the phrase, the apple of your eye.
Yeah.
We use that idiom in English all the time to describe someone we deeply cherish or protect, right?
We do.
But the Hebrew phrase that idiom is actually translating is spectacularly literal and grounded in human anatomy. It translates word for word as the little man in the eye.
To a modern English speaker, the little man in the eye sounds completely bizarre.
It sounds a little creepy, honestly.
It really does. But you have to think about the physical reality of looking at another human being.
Okay.
If you stand very close to someone, face to face, and look directly into the dark center of their pupil, what do you actually see?
Well, the pupil is reflective. So you see a tiny reflection of yourself.
Right.
You see the little man in the eye.
The human pupil acts as a convex mirror. To be the little man in the eye means that you are positioned so close to the other person and they are so intimately focused on you that your tiny reflection is literally caught in the dead center of their vision.
Wow.
It is a hyper-concrete physical anatomical image used to express the deepest level of relational intimacy and protective focus.
And when we translate that concept using our own cultural idiom, apple of your eye, we successfully convey the general idea of cherishing someone, but we completely lose that striking, intimate visual of standing close enough to see your own reflection in their pupil.
We lose the physicality of it.
Because Hebrew is built on these hyper-concrete visual words, right, rather than a massive vocabulary of abstract concepts. So the ancient writers had to develop other tools to build emotional intensity and show degrees of feeling.
Right, they had a different toolkit.
They couldn't just throw 10 different adjectives at a problem. They had to use rhythm and repetition. And here's where it gets really frustrating. Repetition is a technique that English translators actively, aggressively try to erase.
It's true. The translation process is often deeply biased by modern Western literary sensibilities.
How so?
Well, if you think back to any high school English composition class you ever took, what were the rules?
Use a thesaurus.
Exactly. You were told to vary your vocabulary. The cardinal rule of English style is that you do not repeat the same word 3 times in a single sentence.
Right. It's considered bad writing.
Right. English prizes variety, flow, and an expansive use of synonyms. But Hebrew operates on the exact opposite principle.
Really?
Yeah. When a Hebrew writer wants to show extreme emphasis or burning hatred, overwhelming passion, or the absolute finality of an action, they don't look for a synonym. They repeat the exact same word over and over again, like a hammer striking an anvil.
Okay, let's look at how this plays out in the text, because there is a wild, incredibly violent story in the book of Judges about a woman named Jael.
Oh, this is a perfect example.
So to give you some context listening at home, there's a Canaanite military commander named Sisera. He's serving under King Jabin, and he's fleeing a battle.
Running for his life.
Right. He seeks refuge in Jael's tent, expecting the ancient rules of Near Eastern hospitality to protect him. Instead, while he is sleeping, Jael takes a tent peg and a hammer, and she drives the peg completely through his skull into the ground.
It is a shocking violation of cultural norms.
And a brutal assassination. But if you read an English translation of the event, the text smooths it out and usually just says something like, "and she killed him."
Yeah, and she killed him sounds like a simple, detached statement of historical fact. It reads like a police report.
Very clinical.
But the literal Hebrew text is entirely different. It is highly repetitive, almost rhythmic in its brutality. A literal word-for-word rendering reads much more like, "She killed him dead, really dead, 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 she killed him."
Dead, dead, dead.
Yes.
If you handed that to an English editor today, they would say the author sounds unhinged, or like a child who doesn't know any other words.
But the ancient author isn't lacking a vocabulary. They're using repetition as a structural spotlight.
Just shining a huge light on the action.
Exactly. The repetition forces the reader to slow down and dwell on the violence. The author wants you to feel the intensity, the sheer irreversible finality of the act, and frankly, the author's intense hatred for the Canaanite oppressor.
But by smoothing it out to a polite, "She killed him."
Modern translators make the text palatable for a Sunday morning reading. But in doing so, they strip the raw, visceral emotion right out of the narrative.
We don't just lose the emotion, though. We also lose the underlying rhythm of the entire language. The sources talk extensively about a specific Hebrew grammatical tool called the wa consecutive,
Right.
which basically translates to the conjunction and. Hebrew cadence relies heavily on starting almost every single phrase, every single sentence with and.
It creates this sweeping, relentless forward momentum.
Yeah, if you read a truly literal translation of a Hebrew narrative, it feels like a drumbeat. And God said, and there was light, and God saw, and it was good.
It pushes the narrative forward with an inescapable driving force.
But modern English publisher-style guides dictate that text should have varied sentence openings to sound smoother to an English ear.
Exactly. So translators often take a red pen and cut those conjunctions out, replacing them with periods or words like then or however.
They're prioritizing Western aesthetics over ancient structure.
Absolutely. And while it does make the text easier to read by modern standards, it completely destroys the original poetic rhythm, the ancient cadence of an oral culture meant to be read aloud.
So you're left with a text that is factually accurate regarding the events, but structurally castrated.
Structural castration. That is a brutal but completely accurate way to put it.
Well, speaking of structure, this leads us perfectly into exploring one of the most incredible, demanding structural tools in the ancient Hebrew toolkit.
The alphabetic acrostic.
Yes, acrostics.
Acrostics are where the sheer artistry and technical brilliance of the Hebrew language truly shine.
Let's explain this for anyone listening who might not be familiar with the term. What is an alphabetic acrostic?
So an alphabetic acrostic is a highly constrained form of poetry
Yeah.
where each line, or sometimes each block of lines, begins with a successive letter of the alphabet in exact order.
So working your way from A to Z, basically.
Mhm.
Or in the case of the Hebrew alphabet, from Aleph all the way to Tav.
Precisely.
The most famous example of this is Psalm 119. It's a massively long piece of poetry, 176 verses in total. And it is intricately structured in blocks of 8 lines. The first 8 lines of the poem all begin with the letter Aleph. The next 8 lines all begin with the letter Bet. And it continues this mathematical precision through all 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet.
It's incredible. Another beautiful example is Proverbs 31, the famous poem describing the wife of noble character.
Oh, right.
It operates on the exact same principle, moving from Aleph to Tav. But it isn't just a party trick. The structure carries theological meaning.
How so?
By going from A to Z, the poet is symbolically saying that this woman possesses every single virtue, from the beginning of the alphabet all the way to the end.
Oh, I see.
It is a structural way of saying she is thoroughly, comprehensively virtuous. It's an incredibly rigid, mathematically demanding constraint for a poet to work within, especially before the invention of word processors, when they were painstakingly writing this out on parchment.
Wow. The constraint acts as the canvas. And once you understand the rules of that canvas, you can appreciate when an artist deliberately breaks them.
Yes.
Which brings us to what I think is one of the most mind-bending insights in our entire stack of sources today.
The Nahum anomaly.
The Nahum anomaly.
The Book of Nahum, specifically the first chapter, is a brilliant subversive piece of literary art.
Okay, here is the setup for you listening. Nahum chapter 1 starts out as a perfect, highly disciplined alphabetic acrostic. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet.
Right.
It is following the rules perfectly.
Right.
But then, about halfway through the alphabet, something weird happens.
Yeah.
The letters start appearing completely out of order.
Yeah.
And a few verses later, the acrostic just breaks off entirely.
It vanishes.
Yeah, it's completely abandoned, and the text devolves into unconstrained poetry. Now, for a long time, historical scholars looked at that manuscript and assumed something was wrong.
Oh, yeah. They said, oh, a scribe must have dropped the manuscript and copied it out of order. The text is corrupted.
Or they assumed the author was just a mediocre poet who ran out of words and gave up halfway through.
But those historical assumptions completely miss the genius of what the author is actually doing.
Yeah.
You have to ask yourself, what is the subject matter of Nahum chapter 1? Who is he writing about?
Well, Nahum is writing a prophecy directed at Nineveh, the capital of the brutal Assyrian Empire. And the subject matter of chapter 1 is a terrifying vision of the fierce whirlwind of God's vengeance and wrath coming to destroy them.
It is poetry about a literal and spiritual hurricane of divine anger, and the author structurally mirrors that chaos in the poetry itself.
Okay, I love this analogy from earlier. If you're an ancient reader reading this text, it's like watching a painter painstakingly set up a perfectly structured, mathematically precise canvas, carefully painting inside the lines.
Yep.
And then suddenly, they grab buckets of paint and start violently throwing them at the canvas to depict a hurricane.
That's exactly it.
The broken structure is the message. The whirlwind of God's wrath is depicted as being so fierce, so uncontrollable, that it literally rips the Hebrew alphabet apart on the page.
That analogy of throwing the paint perfectly captures the dynamic. The medium itself becomes the message. The disruption of the poetic form is entirely intentional and highly sophisticated.
And again, this is the tragedy of translation.
You simply cannot see this in English.
An English reader just reads a somewhat intense poem about a storm, entirely unaware that in the original language, the ancient letters themselves are being blown apart and scattered across the page.
It really changes the entire experience of reading the text.
It does. And while we're on the topic of untranslatable letters, we have to talk about a word found in the very first verse of the Bible that you will never, ever see in an English translation.
Genesis 1:1.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
It is arguably the most famous, widely recognized sentence ever written in human history. But if you look at the original Hebrew text, right after the verb for created and just before the heavens, there is a tiny 2-letter word.
And it has absolutely no English equivalent. You cannot translate it.
No. It functions as a grammatical marker for the definite direct object, making it grammatically invisible in English. But the significance lies in what those 2 letters actually are.
Okay, lay it on us.
The word is composed of the first and the last letters of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph and Tav.
Ah.
It's the direct Hebrew equivalent of the Greek concept of the Alpha and the Omega, representing the beginning and the end, the entirety of all things.
But the sources take it a step further into the visual realm of ancient Paleo-Hebrew.
They do, yeah.
Because before the block script we associate with Hebrew today, the language was written using pictograms, visual symbols. The letter Aleph was drawn as the head of an ox. It symbolized raw strength, leadership, and crucially within their culture, a sacrifice.
Right.
And the letter Tav was drawn simply as a cross or an X. It was a literal mark used to sign a document or seal a binding covenant.
So, sitting there, untranslated and entirely invisible to the English reader, in the very first verse of Genesis, an ancient Hebrew reader sees a combination of symbols.
The head of an ox and a cross.
They see the pictograms for strength, sacrifice, and a covenant mark. It's this rich, evocative, symbolic meaning completely bound up in the visual history of the ancient letters themselves, sitting silently at the dawn of creation.
That is just wow. So we've looked at the atomic level, the grammar, the verbs, the rhythm, the acrostics, but all of that is, in a way, the interior decorating of the text.
Okay, yeah.
Now we need to zoom out and look at the massive, invisible architectural blueprints that these ancient writers used to construct not just poems, but entire books and historical narratives.
Right, because if the acrostics and wordplays are the interior design, this next concept is the steel framing holding the entire building together.
And it's a structural technique called chiasmus.
Chiasmus.
Let's define this clearly for you listening, because once you see this, you'll start seeing it everywhere. What is a chiasmus?
Think of chiasmus as a mirror image literary structure. It's a way of organizing a narrative, a poem, or even a legal code symmetrically. Scholars typically map it out using letters. A, B, C, B, A.
Okay, walk me through that.
You introduce a theme, a setting, or an event, which we label A. Then you introduce the next event, B. Then you hit the center point of the story, C.
Right.
After that center point, the story works its way backward, mirroring the first half. You have an event that parallels or contrasts with B, we call it B prime, and you end the story with a theme that mirrors the opening A, which is A prime.
To put this in perspective, think about a modern Western story, like a Marvel movie or a typical novel.
Good comparison.
The climax is almost always at the very end of the timeline.
Yeah.
Tension builds and builds chronologically, and the massive explosion or the final kiss or the defeat of the villain happens in the last 10 minutes.
Right, Western storytelling is very linear.
But in a chiastic structure, the most important part of the story, the theological climax, isn't at the end. It is dead in the center, the C point.
The center is the absolute pivot of the narrative. Everything in the first half leads inward toward it, and everything in the second half flows outward from it as a result.
Wow.
And the biblical authors, operating in an oral culture where symmetry aided memorization, use this constantly. Let's look at a prime example, the story of Noah's flood.
Okay, if you read the flood narrative in English, you naturally read it as a straightforward chronological historical logbook.
Exactly.
It rained this many days, the water got this high, the bird was sent out on this day. It reads like a ship's captain writing in a journal.
But when you look at the Hebrew text structurally, it reveals itself to be a perfect, massively complex chiasm. On the front half of the narrative, as the destruction builds, you have a sequence of numbers. 7 days waiting for the flood, then 40 days of rain, then 150 days of the waters rising and prevailing on the earth.
Okay.
That brings you to the exact structural center, the mathematical middle of the text, and what is the pivot point?
The center line of the entire story is, and God remembered Noah.
That single sentence is the C point, and God remembered Noah. And from that exact moment, the entire narrative works in reverse, reversing the destruction. You have 150 days of waters receding, 40 days of waiting, and 7 days waiting for the dove to return. ABCBA.
And the sources point out that there is an incredible piece of Hebrew wordplay happening right at that center pivot to anchor it.
Yes. The Hebrew vocabulary, deliberately clustered around that center point, is built almost entirely on the consonants N, NH, the root NE, wait.
Okay.
In Hebrew, these are the root consonants for words meaning rest, comfort, and grace. And entirely by design, they mirror the consonants of the name Noah itself.
That's amazing.
The mathematical structure of the days, the linguistic wordplay of the root consonants, and the theology of God's grace are all completely seamlessly integrated.
Is architectural poetry.
It really is.
Which brings us to a highly debated text, Genesis chapter 1, the creation account.
Genesis 1 is a prime example of where recognizing ancient literary structure entirely changes how you interact with the text.
Let's dig into that.
Genesis 1 is structured chiastically. It is not written in the style of a historical chronicle. It's designed as a highly stylized, symmetrical, poetic hymn.
How does the structure work there?
Days 1, 2, and 3 establish the realms of creation: light, sky, and sea, and land. Days 4, 5, and 6 populate those specific realms in a parallel structure: sun and moon, birds and fish, and animals and humans. The text is structurally intended to act as a poetic counterpart to the chiastic poetry found later in Genesis 49.
Let me push on the implications of that for a second.
Sure.
If you're telling me that linguistic scholars have proven that Genesis 1 is built as a chiastic poem, a highly structured hymn, rather than a literal, chronological, historical account,
Structurally speaking, yes.
doesn't that fundamentally reframe the massive modern debate between fundamentalist creationism and modern science? If you just look at the original architecture of the text, it strongly suggests the ancient author never intended it to be read as a science textbook or a literal 144-hour timeline.
It is crucial to state that we are not taking a theological stance on how an individual should interpret their faith here.
Absolutely, we are strictly impartial.
But from a strictly scholarly structural perspective, you're highlighting exactly why these hidden architectures matter so much. Structural scholars view the chiasmus of Genesis 1 as a vehicle for conveying profound spiritual and theological truth. That God brought order out of chaos rather than factual, chronological reporting.
The author is using symmetry to teach purpose.
Yes. What is truly fascinating and somewhat tragic is observing how much modern, deeply vitriolic theological arguing happens simply because of genre confusion.
Wow, genre confusion.
We argue over texts that have been translated out of their original architectural forms, losing the cues that tell us how they were meant to be read.
We are furiously arguing over the blueprint, entirely unaware that it is a blueprint for a cathedral of poetry, not a schematic for a tractor.
That is a very apt way to put it.
And chiasmus isn't just used for short poems, right? It structures entire book-length narratives.
Oh, absolutely.
Take the Book of Esther. It's a brilliant, suspenseful political thriller set in the Persian Empire. But if you map out the entire book, what is the chiastic center? What is the pivot point that the entire plot hinges on?
Well, you'd naturally assume the center point would be a massive battle or the dramatic climax where Esther risks her life to confront the king.
Right. But it isn't. The exact structural center of the Book of Esther, the C point, is a quiet night where King Ahasuerus happens to suffer from a bout of insomnia.
Just a sleepless night.
Yeah. He can't sleep, so he casually asks for the royal chronicles to be read to him to bore him to sleep, and in doing so, he discovers that Mordecai, a Jew, previously saved his life from an assassination plot.
That mundane sleeplessness is the pivot.
The ancient rabbis referred to this type of event as a nus, a natural miracle. It's an event that is entirely natural. People get insomnia all the time, but statistically highly improbable in its timing, and it alters the course of history.
The chiasmus elevates this seemingly mundane moment to highlight the theology of the book. God orchestrating salvation through the invisible everyday events of human life.
And 2 Samuel operates on a massive chiasm as well, doesn't it?
It does. The entire book detailing the reign of King David is an extended chiasm.
And the pivot point, the absolute hinge on which the entire kingship and moral trajectory of David swings, is the narrative of David and Bathsheba.
Which serves as the perfect case study for everything we have been discussing today.
Let's dive deep into this specific story. If you're listening, imagine the story of David and Bathsheba as you've heard it in English. Now let's watch all of these hidden elements, the wordplay, the lost meaning, the structural architecture, collide in one of the most famous and devastating stories in the text.
2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12 is universally recognized by scholars as a masterpiece of ancient Hebrew narrative art. The psychological depth conveyed through the language is astounding.
Let's start with the very first sentence. 2 Samuel 11.1. In almost every modern English translation sitting on a bookshelf today, it opens with a scene-setting phrase something like, "In the spring, at the time when kings go off to battle, David sent Joab."
It sounds like standard historical exposition.
Exactly.
But the Hebrew text is doing something far more subtle and deeply devastating. The Hebrew word typically translated as kings in that sentence is melachim. But if you look at the oldest manuscripts, the actual word written in the original text is malachim, which translates to messengers.
Wow.
The words differ by only a single Hebrew consonant.
So a literal reading of the original text says, "In the spring, at the time when messengers go out."
Yes. And English translators, looking at that, often assume it must be a scribal typo.
Because that doesn't make sense to them.
Right. They think, well, messengers don't have a specific season for going out to war, but kings do, so the scribe must have misspelled melachim. So they amend it in English to kings.
But by doing that, they completely obliterate the mother of all narrative wordplays. Because the ancient author is being brilliant here. David is a king. He is supposed to go out to battle with his men, but he doesn't. He abdicates his responsibility. He stays home on his roof in Jerusalem.
Right.
And what does he do instead? He sends messengers.
Exactly. The word malachim becomes the dark motif of the entire chapter.
Yeah.
7 times in this narrative. 7 being a highly significant number in Hebrew storytelling, symbolizing completion messengers are sent back and forth to do David's dirty work.
7 times.
Yes. David sends messengers to ask about Bathsheba's identity. He sends messengers to take her from her home. He sends messengers to his general Joab, carrying the literal death warrant for Bathsheba's husband, Uriah.
The entire tragedy is orchestrated by a king who refuses to go out as a king and instead weaponizes a network of messengers to carry out his secret sins in the dark.
The author indicts David's cowardice in the very first sentence with a pun. At the time when messengers go out?
That's chilling. And then there's the specific verb the author uses when David actually commits the act of taking Bathsheba.
The English text usually says David sent for her and brings her to his house. The Hebrew verb utilized there is asaf.
But asaf doesn't just mean to politely escort someone indoors, does it?
No, it is a word heavily loaded with specific agricultural connotations in an agrarian society. Asaf means to violently pluck or to harvest ripe fruit from a vine or a tree.
Oh, gross.
Now, it can occasionally mean to take in a traveler in need of shelter, but in this specific context, the ancient Hebrew reader immediately hears the predatory, consuming implication.
David is not inviting a guest. He is plucking a piece of fruit for his own consumption, entirely disregarding the humanity of the woman he is taking.
It adds this deeply predatory texture that just makes your skin crawl.
It really does. And the tragedy only deepens later in the story when the prophet Nathan comes to confront David. Nathan doesn't accuse him directly at first. He tells a parable about a rich man with massive flocks of sheep who steals a poor man's one beloved little ewe lamb to feed a guest.
Right, the famous parable.
Nathan tells David that the little lamb was like a daughter to the poor man.
And the Hebrew word for daughter used in that parable is bath.
Bath, which is the exact first syllable of the name Bathsheba.
The prophet Nathan is dropping a massive, heavy-handed, highly dangerous pun right in front of the king's face. He is essentially saying, the rich man took the bath.
And David completely misses it. He flies into a self-righteous rage, demanding the death penalty for the fictional rich man, completely blind to the fact that Nathan is literally saying the name of the woman he assaulted.
He's totally oblivious.
If you're listening to this, imagine the tension in that throne room. Why doesn't David hear the pun?
He misses the pun entirely because the text is relying on a core theme from ancient Israeli wisdom literature.
Okay, what theme is that?
In books like Proverbs, there is a fundamental, inescapable connection between sin and foolishness. Sin literally makes you stupid. It dulls your cognitive senses.
Wow.
David is so thoroughly blinded by his own arrogance, lust, and the desperate cover-up of his guilt that he cannot even hear the phonetic wordplay happening right to his face until Nathan has to explicitly shout, "You are the man."
And speaking of Bathsheba's name, something incredibly chilling happens to her identity in the text following the assault.
Yes. After she is introduced by name at the very beginning of the story, her name is systematically and deliberately erased from the text for almost the entire duration of the tragic fallout.
The narrator just stops calling her Bathsheba. She just becomes the woman. Or, even more pointedly, she is repeatedly referred to as Uriah's wife.
The ancient author is actively refusing to legitimize David's union with her.
Right.
Every single time the text refers to her as Uriah's wife, it acts as a flashing neon sign of God's disapproval of the murder and the theft. It keeps the ghost of the murdered husband present in every scene.
So when does she get her name back?
Her name is only fully restored to the text. She's only called Bathsheba again. At the very end of the narrative, after the illegitimate child of their adultery dies, after David is broken and repents, and after there is a theological shift in God's posture toward them.
So we have to look at the mechanics of that repentance because this is where the English completely fails the theology.
It really does.
When David is finally confronted, he repents. He says, "I have sinned against the Lord." And Nathan says to him, "The Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die."
Wait.
In English, the phrase "put away" sounds incredibly clean. It sounds like God just hit the delete button on a keyboard. The sin vanishes into thin air. No harm, no foul.
But to understand the terrifying reality of this scene, we have to look at the specific Hebrew verb. The word translated as put away is avar.
Okay.
Avar does not mean to annihilate, to forgive into nothingness, or to delete. Avar means to cause something to pass over or to structurally transfer it to a new location.
The sin doesn't just disappear, the guilt moves.
The guilt of the sin is physically transferred, and the immediate question is transferred to where?
Right.
Nathan doesn't pause. He immediately says, "The Lord has transferred your sin. Nevertheless, the child that is born to you shall die."
Oh, wow.
The guilt of the king is transferred to the innocent child, who bears the fatal consequence in David's place. This exchange taps into the deepest, most ingrained mechanics of the Hebrew sacrificial system, the Day of Atonement, the concept of laying hands on a scapegoat and physically transferring the guilt of the community onto an innocent animal that is then sent to its death.
And David would have known that.
David, as an ancient Israelite, understood this terrifying reality immediately. That is precisely why he instantly falls to the ground, fasting and mourning desperately before the child dies, trying to change God's mind before the transfer is finalized.
But in the English translation, that profound, culturally heavy concept of transferred guilt is utterly invisible. We just read that God put it away, and we completely miss the theological mechanism of substitutionary death at work.
It's a huge loss of
It
meaning.
is just incredibly heavy, and it permanently changes how you read the justice and mercy in that story.
Absolutely.
We have spent this entire time looking at how much nuance, poetry, and theology is lost, changed, or flattened out when a translator moves a text from ancient Hebrew and Greek into modern English. But all of this raises a massive fundamental question that we haven't touched on yet.
Okay, what's that?
We are talking about translating from ancient manuscripts, but which ancient Hebrew and Greek manuscripts are we actually translating from?
This is where we leave the realm of grammar and enter the historical battle of the texts.
The manuscript wars.
Yes, because there isn't just one single, perfect, undisputed ancient manuscript sitting under glass in a vault in Jerusalem. There are two distinct ancient textual traditions, two heavyweights in this arena, and they do not always agree.
Let's set the stage for the listener. In one corner, representing the Greek tradition, we have the Septuagint, and in the other corner, representing the Hebrew tradition, we have the Masoretic text. Let's break these down.
The Septuagint, which you'll often see abbreviated in scholarly footnotes with the Roman numerals LXX standing for 70, is an ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament.
Okay.
According to tradition, it was commissioned in Alexandria, Egypt, beginning around 280 BC by King Ptolemy. It was created specifically for the massive Jewish diaspora Jews who were living outside of Israel, who had integrated into the broader Greco-Roman world, and who spoke Greek as their primary everyday language and could no longer fluently read ancient Hebrew.
So the Septuagint is a very ancient Greek translation of older Hebrew scrolls. And what about the Masoretic text?
The Masoretic text, often abbreviated as MT, is the universally standardized Hebrew text of the Old Testament used in Judaism today. It was meticulously finalized and preserved by highly dedicated groups of Jewish scribes known as the Masoretes.
Okay, so that's the Hebrew one.
Right, but their primary standardization work happened much later in history, roughly between the 6th and 10th centuries AD. The original Hebrew scrolls only contain consonants. The Masoretes developed a complex system of vowel pointings and marginal notes to ensure the text was pronounced and copied with absolute mathematical precision. They would literally count the middle letter of a scroll to ensure nothing was added or lost.
Their dedication to preservation was legendary. But here is the massive twist that most people sitting in a pew on a Sunday morning or reading a Bible in a hotel room have absolutely no idea about.
Right.
If you open a modern Protestant Bible, the ESV, the NIV, the King James, the translators used the later Hebrew Masoretic text as the base document for the Old Testament. The logic seems sound. It's written in Hebrew, the original language of the Israelites, so it must be the most accurate original version.
Makes sense on the surface.
But when you flip to the New Testament and you read the apostles quoting the Old Testament, they're almost exclusively quoting from the older Greek Septuagint.
The tension there is fascinating. The founders of the Christian church are utilizing the Greek Septuagint, but modern Protestant translators rely on the medieval Hebrew Masoretic text. And for centuries, scholars vigorously defended the use of the Masoretic text by arguing, listen, the Septuagint is just a translation into Greek. The Masoretic text, even if the finalized manuscripts we possess date to the Middle Ages, is in the original Hebrew. Therefore, it must represent a pure, unbroken chain back to the original authors.
That was the academic consensus for hundreds of years. But then, in 1947, a Bedouin teenage shepherd is looking for a lost goat near the Dead Sea. He throws a rock into a cave, hears the sound of shattering pottery, and accidentally triggers the greatest archaeological earthquake in biblical scholarship,
The Dead Sea Scrolls.
the Dead Sea Scrolls.
The discovery at Qumran changed everything we thought we knew about manuscript transmission. Inside those clay jars, archaeologists found thousands of fragments of Hebrew scrolls of the Old Testament. And through carbon dating and paleography, the study of ancient handwriting styles, they proved that these scrolls predated the time of Christ by 1 to 2 centuries.
Wow.
These documents were vastly older than the oldest medieval Masoretic manuscripts we had.
We finally had access to Hebrew scrolls from the ancient world. And the massive surprise that shocked the academic world was that these ancient Hebrew scrolls did not always match the later Masoretic texts.
No, they didn't.
In many crucial, highly debated places, the ancient Hebrew perfectly matched the Greek Septuagint.
One of the most famous and definitive examples of this is the Book of Jeremiah.
Right, let's talk about Jeremiah.
If you read Jeremiah in the Greek Septuagint, the book is significantly shorter by about 1/8, and the chapters are arranged in a different order compared to the Hebrew Masoretic text.
That's a huge difference.
It is. For over a millennium, scholars assumed the Greek translators in Alexandria had just gotten lazy, or they had taken editorial liberties and abridged the book. But the caves at Qumran contain fragments of the Book of Jeremiah in ancient Hebrew that matched the shorter, rearranged Greek Septuagint structure perfectly.
That proves that the Septuagint translators hadn't abridged or altered anything. They were faithfully translating a genuinely older, lost Hebrew textual tradition. And it strongly suggests that the later Masoretic scribes, or their predecessors, had actually expanded and heavily edited their version of the text over the centuries.
The Dead Sea Scrolls vindicated the Septuagint. It proved that the Greek text was not a sloppy translation, but rather a highly reliable, transparent window into a very ancient Hebrew textual tradition that existed centuries before the Masoretes standardized their specific version.
And if you are listening and thinking, okay, that's fun academic trivia, you need to realize that the differences between these two textual traditions lead to massive tectonic doctrinal shifts.
They absolutely do.
Now, we are strictly impartial on this show. We are not taking theological sides between these traditions, but we have to look objectively at the facts of the text and how they impact modern belief. Take the famous prophecy in Isaiah 7.14.
This is perhaps the most frequently cited example of textual divergence. In the Greek Septuagint, the famous prophecy in Isaiah uses the specific Greek word parthenos. Parthenos biologically and explicitly means virgin. When the author of the Gospel of Matthew quotes this prophecy to validate the miraculous birth of Jesus, he quotes the Septuagint, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive."
But if a modern translator looks at the Hebrew Masoretic text for that exact same verse in Isaiah 7.14,
The Masoretic text utilizes the Hebrew word alma. Now, an alma certainly can be a virgin, but the word itself simply means a young woman of marriageable age or a maiden. It does not inherently carry the strict biological specificity of the Greek word parthenos.
so depending entirely on which manuscript tradition the translation committee decides to use on any given Tuesday, the English text either prophesies a miraculous virgin birth, or it simply states that a young woman is going to have a baby.
It's a massive shift in theological implications.
Yeah, and it entirely depends on whether you follow the text the apostles utilized or the text the medieval scribes standardized.
The divergence goes even beyond the translation of individual words. It actually dictates the physical table of contents of your Bible.
Oh, right. The books themselves.
The Septuagint includes a number of historical and wisdom books that the Masoretic text ultimately dropped or rejected from their canon.
These are known as the deuterocanonical books, or the Apocrypha. Books like Tobit, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, the Wisdom of Solomon.
Because the early Christian church universally adopted the Greek Septuagint as their primary scripture, these books were fully integrated into the Christian Old Testament for over 1,000 years. The Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches still include them in their Bibles today.
But not Protestants.
Right. During the Reformation in the 16th century, Protestant reformers made a deliberate theological decision to align their Old Testament canon exclusively with the Hebrew Masoretic text, arguing for the primacy of the Hebrew language. By doing so, they dropped the deuterocanonical books.
So the very table of contents of the Bible sitting on your desk is the direct result of this ancient ongoing battle of the texts.
It really is.
It is wild to think about how much history is hidden behind the binding of a book. So for you listening to this deep dive right now, If you are driving your car or walking your dog and you want to access this hidden, multidimensional world, but you realistically do not have 10 years to go to a university and learn Koine Greek, Biblical Hebrew, and Aramaic, what are the practical tools? How do you put the 3D glasses on?
Well, the fantastic news is that we live in an era where you do not have to become a linguist to access this depth. There are incredible tools freely available. One of the most foundational is Strong's Exhaustive Concordance.
I absolutely love Strong's. It is such a brilliant, brute force piece of scholarship.
It really is.
It was put together in the late 1800s by Dr. James Strong. Basically, he and his team assigned a specific reference number to every single original Greek and Hebrew root word used in the Bible. So you can look up the English word covenant in a verse, see its assigned Strong's number, and flip to the dictionary in the back to read the exact Hebrew definition, the root origins, and every other place it is used, all without knowing a single letter of the Hebrew alphabet.
It's so accessible.
You can independently discover that the root word for covenant involves the concept of cutting, referencing the ancient visceral blood rituals of cutting animals in half to seal a treaty. It unlocks the imagery immediately.
It completely democratizes access to the original languages. Another highly effective strategy is to utilize extremely literal, word-for-word English translations for your study time.
Like which ones?
Now, these translations might sound a bit clunky, wooden, or formal to a modern ear accustomed to smooth prose, but literal translations like the New American Standard Bible or even the 1611 King James Version prioritize preserving the original ancient sentence structures, the repetition, and the specific word connections over modern readability.
They preserve the structural integrity. If you are reading historical literature or specific religious texts that heavily quote or rely on King James phrasing, like the Book of Mormon or early American historical documents, using a literal translation helps you clearly see the linguistic threads connecting those modern texts all the way back to the ancient Near Eastern world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You see the echoes that smoother, thought-for-thought modern translations often accidentally erase in their pursuit of easy reading.
Wow. We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We have journeyed deep beneath the surface of the English text. If there's one core takeaway from our entire stack of sources, it is that reading a translation is, by its very definition, reading an interpretation.
Absolutely.
A translator is not just swapping out words. They are constantly forced to make choices. They have to choose between ambiguity and clarity, between rhythm and readability, between manuscripts. And every single choice leaves a piece of the original world behind on the cutting room floor.
We have explored the intense, reflexive psychological involvement hidden inside the Greek middle voice. We have seen the violent structural breakdown of an acrostic poem in Nahum, mirroring a terrifying storm of divine wrath. We have winced at the tragic, inescapable puns of King David's greatest moral failure and the terrifying mechanism of transferred guilt.
It's a lot to process.
The original texts are wild. They are vibrant, physical, culturally heavy, and incredibly complex. They're absolutely not the flat, binary, easily digestible documents we so often assume they are.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. We have seen today how much of the artistry, the poetic structure, the cultural context, and even the core theological mechanics of these texts are inextricably bound up in the untranslatable quirks of ancient dead languages.
Right.
So consider this. How much of our modern religious division, how much of the bitter, vitriolic debate we see in the world today is actually just a fight over a well-meaning translator's necessary compromise?
That's a great question.
What other massive, unquestionable certainties are we arguing over today, ready to go to war over, that simply did not even exist in the mind or the language of the original ancient writer?
It is a profoundly humbling question. It serves as a reminder that the text is always deeper than our reading of it, that there is always more to learn, and that genuine curiosity is a far more effective tool for understanding than rigid certainty.
Keep questioning the text in front of you. Keep looking for the depth beneath the English. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.